Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms from Diligent Institute, your source for the latest and greatest in corporate governance, all in 10 minutes. I'm your host, Lisa Edwards, Executive Chair of Diligent Institute, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Claudia Allen, who is a Senior Advisor at KPMG's esteemed Board Leadership Center. Claudia, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
So, this week's edition is super interesting to me because I get asked a lot about private company practices. And oftentimes my answer is, you know what? I have no idea. There's not a ton of data available. So enter KPMG for the win. You do a survey of private company board members. Can you walk us through the findings from your latest survey?
Sure, I'd be happy to. We recently surveyed approximately 600 directors of private companies. And about 90% of them said they had at least one independent director on their board, although sometimes management didn't know how best to use the skills of the directors. And then when we looked at individuals who were founders of companies, there was a lower incidence of independent directors, and perhaps that reflects a desire to maintain more control of a founder-led business. And then we asked where independent directors can add the most value, and there was a pretty strong response there. About 75% said it was in terms of serving as a sounding board for the CEO and other executives, advising on strategy, and interestingly, helping to balance the views of management and owners. We also asked about committees, and a majority of the respondents said their boards had audit or compensation committees. But quite interestingly, almost 31% said their boards had no formal committees. So I think different levels of maturity on that scale. And then we asked about board leadership, and we found about a quarter of the respondents said their boards had independent chairs, and about 15% said they had independent lead directors. And we also tried to drill down into the committee space. And we found there that for companies for respondents who said their companies had audit or compensation committees, about 2/3 of those were chaired by independent directors. But then again, on the other side of the spectrum, about a quarter of the respondents said their boards had no independent leadership, whether at the full board or committee level. And I think lastly, there were some interesting findings on board effectiveness. Here, directors said they had made strides in terms of overseeing strategy. And at the same time, when we asked them, where is there room for improvement, 2/3 of them said in terms of overseeing strategy, and about a little less than 50% said in terms of overseeing risk and talent.
That one was actually a little surprising to me, I have to say, when I dug into it, because I thought, the whole point of small companies when they're in these fast growth phases and they're sort of getting traction in the market is that there's typically really good product market fit. And so the strategy is a little bit sort of, we know what we're doing. We just don't know all the governance things to add on to that so let's bring somebody in from outside. The committee structure also made sense to me because those are, the committees are the committees that you would typically have when you go public, and you would need to have independent directors on there. So some of it made perfect sense to me, and other parts of it, like that part that you just mentioned, the lean in on strategy. I think there's a lens there that says, of course, that's valuable to have a third party, but there's also sort of but what about these other things? Did you sort of dig into that at all?
Well, I think, the strategy is it's an issue that so many boards and management struggle with where the line is. And so, management owns the strategy, but it's really, when do you bring in the board, to kick the tires before it's finalized and to provide some useful input and challenge assumptions. And I think that's what the data is getting at.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The other, you sort of published a companion-ish white paper titled How Independence Can Add Value to Private Boards, where you talked to directors in this roundtable format and also to CEOs. What were some of the things that, some of the nuance that you learned from those roundtables?
Well, I think not surprisingly, there was a lot of interest in how you identify the characteristics you would want in independent directors. And again, this sort of depends on the stage of the company, how mature is it, and the ownership structure. So if we looked at family businesses, for example, often a desire for somebody to help professionalize governance, to help put in place governance structures. PE-backed companies, often a desire for industry expertise, somebody who has experience taking a company public. And then we also found, there are a lot of areas where boards and management think they could really use some more skills. And that was particularly noticeable in the area of M&A and then digital transformation. And then there were some, really interesting discussions among the directors about what they really bring to the table. And there was an overwhelming feeling that they bring an objectivity, an unbiased view, and they have the ability to challenge the status quo, which I think is quite important. And, that shows up in a number of ways, including helping the board focus more on the future, because there is that inevitable tendency to focus on, recent results. But really, the board, more than anybody, needs to be looking at the future. And independent directors can also be very helpful in looking at talent issues, talent development, succession, which, in the context, for example, of a family company can be particularly challenging. And then also in the family company context, there was some, interesting dialogue about using advisory boards. So, for example, when the family, the business, the executives are not ready for independent directors, using an advisory board of people with domain expertise who can help management with strategy, competition, risk oversight, etc. So it's being used in some companies as an interim step before bringing on independent directors.
That advisory board is really interesting because it sort of gives you some of the benefits without having to give away the votes, if you will. So from a control perspective, I can see where a family business in particular would say, we need somebody, but we don't need somebody that's sort of deciding everything. So really interesting finding. When you looked at how the difference between how a public company might onboard a new director and the way that a private company does the same thing, typically there's a very set process, almost here's the book for a public company director. How does that vary with private company boards, and how can directors, if they're joining a private company board, how can they avoid the pitfalls of sort of that onboarding process?
Yeah, I think the biggest pitfall in the private company context is not having an onboarding program, which a lot of private company directors say has been their experience. And I think that's sometimes simply because the CEO is doing things the way things have been done in the past, and not a lot of thought was given to it. And when we looked at our survey data, it also showed up as an area where directors were saying they were not very effective. And, if you're not onboarded well, you can effectively be sidelined for a period of time, if not, for longer. So I think the answer is to have an onboarding program. And I think it should be an iterative process. You look at it each time you do it. But in addition to providing, basic documents like committee charters, bylaws, recent minutes, strategic plans, you want to provide briefings on key areas, strategy, finances, risk profile, etc. Then I think you want to have the new director sit down with the CEO, the CFO, other members of the C-suite, and have a back and forth discussion. And then it's important to ask the new director what he or she wants to learn more about. And here I think it's almost incumbent upon all directors, whether private or public companies, to talk about what they want in their onboarding. So if there are particular areas of interest, if tutorials are needed, ask for it. It will make you a better director. And then I think a very helpful thing to do is 12 or 18 months later, you can supplement that onboarding with, a sort of a reboarding where you have a director who has more experience, understands the company better, and may want to dig into some additional issues. I mean, of course, respecting the boundary between management and the board, but to get a deeper view.
Yeah, I think the reboarding is a really interesting concept. And I think it could be even a really interesting concept in a public company directorship because, it's such a drinking from the fire hose when you first start. And it's sort of you meet everyone and all the new names and all the new functions. And, it sort of takes a while to absorb it and sort of start to internalize it. And I think at that point, then saying, okay, I'm not afraid to ask the stupid questions a second time and getting in there and really making sure there's a deep understanding there can be really benefit to that. So I think that's a really good takeaway.
Yeah, and Lisa, I've seen it used at public companies, very effectively. I think there's a lot of focus generally on making onboarding a better process for directors.
So let's like dig into that a little bit more. As an incoming independent director, and it might be the first or only one on a private company board, how do you ensure that you're actually adding value?
I guess we're talking about private companies, but I think one of the first steps is to understand why you're being asked to serve on the board. What is it the CEO is seeking from you? What are the other directors seeking? What is management seeking? And make sure that's consistent with what you want to do and where your skills are. And then making sure as well that you're a good cultural fit. Do you think you would mesh well with the other board members, with the CEO, with management? It doesn't mean you have to all think the same. It's just, can you work together effectively as a group? And then once you join a board, it can be very helpful to ask for a mentor, somebody who served on the board for a period of time, who can also give you some practical wisdom on how the board operates, the personalities on the board, how the board interacts with management. And then to ask that individual for feedback after each meeting or for a period of time. How am I doing? Where could I improve? And obviously, having a regular self-evaluation process for the full board, I think, can also provide a lot of information to shareholders. And then I would also say learn as much as you can about the business. You're going to get a lot from management, but read some trade publications. If it's a retailer, go to the stores, get a better feel for the business. If you can, ask to serve or sit through every committee meeting of the board for a period of time. That will clearly give you more insights. And then I think it's some really basic advice, like having the courage to speak up. If you don't understand something, you have to ask. You can't assume the person next to you understands. And if you have a different point of view, I think you respectfully speak up, because that's actually one of the reasons you're there, to bring a different perspective.
Yeah, that's great advice. And, I think it's such a relearning almost for going from a public company board to a private board, where the mantra of, nose in, hands out. Sometimes on a private board, they actually want your hands in. They want to, talk to your contacts or understand what your thoughts are on strategy, and, in a different way than in a public company. And it can be sort of almost a relearning process.
I agree.
Well, that was such valuable information. As I said, I get asked all the time about private companies, and it's a space that can be a little opaque. So you're doing a great service here, sort of bringing this survey out. Thank you, Claudia, for breaking it down to us. For our listeners who would like to learn more, where can they go to read that report?
The KPMG Board Leadership Center has a website, and our reports and other information are available there.
Fantastic. So thank you, everyone, for listening, and join us next time for another edition of Inside Today's Boardrooms.